For KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, January 12th, 2014. I'm Scott Horton. This is Anti-War Radio. All right, y'all, welcome to the show. It is Anti-War Radio. I'm your host, Scott Horton, here every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 9 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. My website is scotthorton.org. You can find all my interview archives there, more than 3,000 of them now, going back to 2003, scotthorton.org. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at /Scott Horton Show. Our guest today is Barry Lando. He's written this great new piece for Counterpunch called The American Legacy in Iraq. He's the author, he's a former producer for 60 Minutes on CBS and is the author of the new novel, The Watchman's File. He also helped make the documentary, The Trial of Saddam Hussein. Welcome to the show, Barry. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
Very good. Very happy to have you on the show. And I got to tell you, I was very pleased to see your article at counterpunch.org. So many people just want to pretend the Iraq War never happened. It's the new forgotten war after Korea now. And there's just so little coverage of it for the most part, and certainly as far as historical records, although it is back in the news with kind of the heating back up of the Sunni-Shia civil war there and the fight over Anbar province. But so good timing to see this piece here at counterpunch.org, The American Legacy in Iraq. I'm sure you're familiar with the story that at least the British, I don't know if they ever polled the Americans about this, but the British people had answered that they thought that only 10 or 20,000 people had died in the entire Iraq War, which just goes to show the complete and total blackout of real information about what's going on there. So I'm sure the American people are just as wrong about it.
Recently, just in an article that they wrote about the war, also only referred to American casualties. It said it cost America 4,000 lives and $1 trillion. Not a mention made of what it cost Iraq.
Right. Yeah, and even good anti-war congressmen like Walter Jones, who, you know, he started out being Freedom Fries Jones, and now he's as anti-war as anybody in Washington, D.C., but I don't think I've ever heard him murmur so much as a word about the civilian casualties or any other casualties in these wars other than the American ones. And, you know, that's part of the brainwash, and that's what helps make it okay to keep killing people, is to differentiate the value of their lives from our own. But anyway, so let's get into it. Let's go back to, I don't know, say 1980 and Jimmy Carter's green light for Saddam back when he was our loyal sock puppet there.
Yeah, it's not clear when Saddam invaded Iran after Khomeini had taken over and had taken the hostages. You're talking about that?
Right. Yeah, I remember there was at least at Robert Perry's site, he had a document that was Alexander Haig reporting back to Ronald Reagan that King Fahd told him that Jimmy Carter had given Saddam Hussein the green light to invade through him. So exactly,
that's about the only document there is to show it. I tried to investigate that in writing my book Web of Deceit about Iraq, and that was by far the strongest evidence. Though everything seemed, all circumstantial as the evidence was that the U.S. did give the go-ahead. They certainly supported Saddam after the invasion, and more and more strongly as the war went on.
Mm. Yeah, well, and there's no question about Ronald Reagan's support. There's the famous picture, of course, of Special Envoy Donald Rumsfeld over there shaking hands with Saddam Hussein in 1983. What was going on there?
Well, shaking hands, and by then, Rumsfeld was there to make deals with Saddam about the supplying of intelligence and weapons to Saddam, and at the same time, hardly a word about human rights. Also, hardly a word, or not a word at all, about the news that was already coming out from that Saddam was using chemical weapons already against the Iranians. And the U.S. thereafter agreed to supply. There was a guy from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, who was on the ground in Iraq, in Baghdad, giving them coordinates of the Iranian positions. And as the U.S. knew full well that Saddam was using chemical weapons to hit them.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, in that case, it almost sounds like they're really just at war with Iran and they're using Saddam as plausible deniability in a way, right? Here's some chemical weapons. Here's some satellite information for targeting with them. And
well, in fact, even you remember when Halabja came, when Saddam turned his chemical weapons against a Kurdish village after the Kurds had risen up as the war was going on against Iran. Saddam bombed his own Kurds with chemical weapons, and the United States was still was giving intelligence aid and other arms to Saddam, and the U.S., the White House, did its best to keep that whole scandal quiet, and there were no sanctions brought against Saddam for doing that. Mm-hmm. And the United States was the main reason there weren't any.
Yeah, they tried to blame it on Iran. In fact, Jude Wanniski, in his defenses of Saddam before the war in 2003, when he was trying to stop the war, he had, I guess, fallen for the lie that Iran had did Halabja back when, and he was still using that as a reason to not attack Saddam now, that it's in doubt that Saddam did it, when, of course, that was the centerpiece of Colin Powell's campaign, that back when this guy worked for us, he'd committed this massacre.
I spoke to the DIA agent who was on the ground in Iraq at the time, and he said that when Halabja took place and the U.S. Found out about it immediately, they sent word to Washington saying, hey, he's using chemical weapons against his own people now, and they also found he was using binary chemical weapons against the Iranians, the worst kind of chemical weapons, nerve gas. Washington said to the DIA people in Baghdad, they said, hold on, we're going to talk about this. And for 1 week, there were no contacts with the government in Iraq. And then Washington gave the word that we're going to go ahead and continue to support them. So they knew full well what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. And now, to what extent did any of the chemical and or germ weapons actually come from the United States, as opposed to just other Western countries like France?
I think they came from a number of different countries. A lot came from Germany, even England. The United States wasn't the only one, but the U.S. was supplying certain components and weapons, although a lot of people in the Pentagon and other people trying to halt exports to Iraq, knowing what was going on there, did their best to stop it, but the White House kept pushing them through.
Mm. And wasn't part of the scandal at the time about funneling the money to Saddam by way of farm loans, agricultural subsidies, or something like that?
Exactly. And there was Italy's Banco Nazionale del Lavoro, made considerable loans to Iraq, huge amounts of loans to Iraq. It was a very seamy process. The CIA was fully aware of what was going on. In fact, it was thought that they were probably the ones who were orchestrating the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And now let me ask you this, because I was just a kid at the time, really, but in the 1980s, say right there at the end of the Cold War, 1989 through 91, could you have imagined, or do you think anybody could have imagined that our ally, our loyal sock puppet fascist dictator over there, Saddam Hussein, that he and his country would serve as the whipping boy for American power for the next generation, for the next 20 years with the fall of the USSR, that this is where we would go to fight?
Yeah, amazing. Absolutely amazing. And I think that we were talking at the beginning about the Americans not knowing anything about Iraq. I mean, it's not just about what happened during the latest invasion. I think the entire history of U.S. relations with Iraq, and certainly other parts of the Middle East as well, but are really in what I call kind of an historical black hole. Mm. Either they were never reported at the time, or if they were, Americans just didn't want to know, and very little attention was ever given to them, and it's all been forgotten.
Right. Yeah, in fact, it's pretty arbitrary to even start this conversation in 1980, where we could go back to the 1950s and the CIA's help for Saddam Hussein and his cousin and their overthrow of the king, and right. And then the history of the CIA, like it was Cambodia under Pol Pot or something. The CIA giving out lists of anybody with glasses to be rounded up and shot.
Right. In 1963, General Qasem was overthrown. He was kind of a nationalist leader in Iraq, and Saddam had come in with him. And he was overthrown, and Saddam Hussein then was one of the ones who participated in the torture and murdered of hundreds, perhaps thousands of supposed communists and leftists. and they were working off lists. A lot of those lists were provided by the CIA.
So we're talking generations of brutality from the Americans visited upon these people. And of course,
well, you remember, it wasn't Iraq, but you go back to 1953 in Iran, the CIA already overthrew Mossadegh, the first, democratically elected leader of Iran, which is really what led to the situation in Iran today.
Right. Yeah, and all the effort to support Saddam in the 1980s to contain their revolution. The policy that George Bush Jr. reversed in 2003, but I'm skipping ahead here. It's Barry Lando. He's written this great piece for Counterpunch, The American Legacy in Iraq. So then 1990, 91, let's go summer 1990, Saddam Hussein gets the message from April Glaspie, something or another. I guess I'll let you characterize it. But he goes ahead and he invades Kuwait. Can you give us the Barry Lando version of what went on there? Because there's a discrepancy.
I find the invasion of Kuwait one of the most interesting parts of the whole history that no one has really seriously looked at. I think there's a good book there somewhere. That when after the war with Iran was over and Iraq was totally exhausted, and then Kuwait demanded that Iraq pay it billions of dollars, which Kuwait had loaned Iraq actually to fight Iran in their place. Tensions are increasing between Iraq and Kuwait. They always had been a lot of tension. And Saddam is very upset that Kuwait is acting very arrogantly and apparently secretly drilling oil, taking Iraqi oil as well. In any case, as this is going on, General Schwarzkopf, who is then heading the Middle East command of the U.S. Army, was telling the Kuwaitis, don't bend down, don't keep hanging in there, don't give way to Saddam, don't negotiate with them. And they were getting the same message from the CIA. And at the same time, when Saddam went to talk to the American ambassador, April Glaspie, and told her about his problems and said, what would you do if we moved against Kuwait? She basically said, well, the U.S. has no interest in that area at all. There's no red lines. But she wasn't the only one. Several American officials made that same statement in different places. She wasn't the only one at all. So Saddam was totally nonplussed when he moved into Kuwait, and all of a sudden it's like he's moved into a trap which snapped shut.
Right.
And after that, when Bush himself said at the time of the invasion he didn't know what he was going to do, and for several days he literally did not know how he was going to react. And it was only after Margaret Thatcher came there to talk to him in Aspen, where they were meeting, that Bush suddenly decided, okay, he's going to react forcefully, very forcefully, and there was no way he was going to let Saddam out of the trap, and they never did.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so I guess, the April Glaspie part of it, the permission to Saddam, the green light that we're not interested in.
Yeah, but it wasn't just her. It wasn't just her. It was a lot of American officials.
Right. Well, that part of it is legend at this point. Even Ross Perot brought it up in the debates in '92 and that kind of thing. But the part about Norman Schwarzkopf telling the Kuwaitis to be intransigent and to not negotiate, I didn't know about that. I certainly knew that, what was that dispute was that he was trying to make enough money to pay them back the money he borrowed from them to defend them from Iran, or to fight their side of the war anyway, in the Iran-Iraq war. And they were overproducing from their shared oil wells and had the price of oil down so low that he couldn't possibly pay them back the money he owed them. And that was what he was sick and tired of.
Iraq was going broke, and Saddam was getting more and more furious, and the Kuwaitis were incredibly arrogant and almost daring him to attack. And and Saddam didn't know it at the time, and the American people didn't know it at the time, but Schwarzkopf kept telling him, we've got your back, kept telling the Kuwaitis that.
Right. Boy, and the rest is history. And now, how many people died in that first Gulf War Operation Yellow Ribbon and American Flag from 1991?
From 1990, how many people died? I don't think, you mean in Iraq?
Yeah.
I don't think anyone, has the totals. There was one of the most brutal part of it came with the uprising after the Saddam's forces had been driven out of Kuwait, and George Bush, H.W. Bush, had made a speech, made a couple of radio addresses to the Iraqis as the U.S. was preparing to move militarily there, telling the Iraqi people to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein.
I actually had the clip here that I got from your movie, Barry. Let's play it.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
All right, that's the clip you're referring to there.
Yeah, but it wasn't just that. I mean, there was that. He did that twice, but the U.S. also prepared propaganda leaflets, which in the shape of the equivalent of Iraqi dollar bills or $10 bills. Millions of them were dropped from low-flying planes and helicopters over Iraq. So it wasn't just Bush himself, but there was a written message as well. The word was out, and the U.S. wanted them to rise up, and then they did. And George Bush turned his back, and he left them to be slaughtered.
Yeah.
And the number of people slaughtered, the Shiites, estimates are the hundreds of thousands, and tens of thousands of Kurds were killed as well, because they also rose up.
And then that's where the real quagmire set in, because, now we can't leave because we got these people in so much trouble. Now we have to have no-fly zones over the north and south. And, of course, the never-ending snipe hunt for weapons of mass destruction kicked in. Yeah.
The funny thing is that most Americans don't even know about the uprising, and of course, the Iraqis never forgot about it. They felt they were totally betrayed. And the funny thing is that Wolfowitz, who was then in the Pentagon, is always considered to be kind of a hawk and on the wrong side of things by liberals. He was the one who kept urging Bush. He said, no, we've got to go in, finish this thing off, go into Baghdad, and at least support this uprising. And Bush said no.
Right, well, which probably was the right decision if he hadn't, the problem being that he told them to rise up and left them high and dry like the Great Bay of Pigs in the desert. But when Bush Jr. took Wolfowitz's advice and went ahead and fought the war for the Shiite uprising, we saw what happened. They destabilized. Well, they got damn near a million people killed, and then they destabilized every nation in the region and set up the excuse for 10 more interventions.
You're right, but I think the first time around, what happened was the uprising looked like it was going to be successful because the army started going over as well. That was the key thing. The Iraqi generals were sort of looking at who was winning, and it looked like the rebels were winning. American troops were only a few miles away from where the fighting was going on, and the Iraqi army was ready to move. They were ready to support the rebellion. But then they heard the rebels made pleas. They even sent delegations to Washington, and they were making their air was filled with their pleas to the Americans to help. And America said no, not just military, sending the troops in, but even sending in weapons, giving them weapons. There were huge ammunition stocks that were held by the Americans in southern Iraq at the time. They refused to let the rebels get access to those ammunition stocks. We even talked to some rebels who were prevented from marching on Baghdad by American troops. And, of course, the Americans allowed Saddam to continue flying his helicopters, his gunships. So the possibility is it may not even have been necessary for the United States to send troops in and to occupy Baghdad. The uprising looked like it was going to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they really short-circuited something. I didn't realize that was something actually that I learned from this clip from your movie that you linked to in your Counterpunch article, is the part about the American helicopters even landing on the roads and stopping the army in their tracks, the Iraqi army, when they're marching on Saddam. Unbelievable.
No, I spoke to American soldiers who said they were literally in tears as they were listening to and watching what was going on, and were being told by their commanders they could not help.
All right, now, so we got to talk about this embargo, because the theory was that the embargo was being waged, really a virtual blockade, complete blockade by the United Nations and every member state against Iraq, and it was being waged against the people of Iraq. They admitted that much, but the point being, I think the Democrats explained in the 1990s that if we can make these people hungry enough and desperate enough, they'll blame Saddam, and they'll take out their anger on him, and they'll rise up and overthrow him. And then they just kept it that way, no matter how long it went without him being overthrown.
Yeah, no, the people were, and there was no way they could, because Saddam ruled by terror, and there was no way the people could rise up. They were weak, and all it did was, because Saddam did control the food and petrol and key supplies, the government controlled those. That gave them, in a way, even more power. And the whole thing was it was close to a genocide. It was an awful way of waging war against an entire people.
Yeah, and you talk about the psychological damage to a whole generation of people who were raised up during that time. Can you elaborate a little bit about that?
Well, this is what This was a group of Harvard medical researchers who, after the embargo and sanctions had been in place for only a few months, came in and they started studying the young people of Iraq, their not just their nutrition levels, their health situation, but also their mental situation, and they found them to be among I forget exactly what the word was, among the worst, the most suffering, most shell-shocked youth of anywhere on the world on the globe that they had ever studied. And this was while the sanctions were just in their first year. Of course, they went on for 12 years. And what I found kind of interesting or remarkable is that generation who lived through the sanctions, who lived through the two wars, and all the bloodshed and destruction that went on, they are the ones who have come of age in Iraq today. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who are attempting to run the country or rip it apart. And meanwhile, of course, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of the best educated Iraqis long ago have fled to other parts of the world. So Iraq has been a totally destroyed nation.
Mm-hmm. All right, now, let me interrupt you here to say that I don't like it when people throw around the term genocide lightly, because it has a very specific definition. I think people overuse it, but I also think that you're not overusing it. And you link in here to this Defense Intelligence Agency report, Iraq's water treatment vulnerabilities, how we can kill the civilians of Iraq, how we can poison their water supply with germs.
Yeah, they're astonishing documents. People should take a look at them. It's hard to believe that they're for real. But they set about and cold-bloodedly figuring out how they could take apart Iraq's most important infrastructure. And then after they did that, they then very carefully calculated the mortality figures among children in Iraq over the following months and years.
Yeah. All right, and now, we're actually kind of running short on time, so, here, we'll go ahead and play this clip. It's pretty short. Here's Bill Clinton Secretary of State Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes in regard to the sanctions, talking with Leslie Stahl.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
All right, so that's from 1996 there. And that clip is legend in the Middle East, and it's said to be at least a big part of what has incited terrorism against the United States, including, if you read bin Laden's declarations of war against America from 96 and 98, they both go on at length against the women and children of Iraq. He says, how come your blood is blood, but their blood is water? We'll show you. And of course, the blockade and the no-fly zones being enforced from bases on the Holy Peninsula of Saudi Arabia and all of that. And so that's kind of, helped cause the September 11th attack, helped motivate the September 11th attack, which then became the excuse. They pretended that that was the first day in history, and now they can begin intervening over there in the Middle East. And we've seen how much bloodshed they've let, really from Morocco to the Philippines, but especially in Iraq. They went back to Iraq in 2003. And so in the last couple of minutes here, I was hoping you could explain, kind of give a thumbnail of how many people's, best estimate have died and what kind of trauma their society has suffered from the last major phase of American intervention there.
Well, I think in the I've read somewhere the total, I don't think anybody really knows, but the total number of Iraqis killed in the last phase after the last invasion was, I think one estimate was, the estimates go from something like 100,000 up to 400,000. The 100,000 are like direct, battle casualties. The 400,000 include not just direct, but also indirect. In other words, malnutrition, infrastructure breaking down, health, all the effects of it. But apart from that, you also have literally millions of Iraqi refugees who either fled the country or who were displaced internally. And you also had a civil war that broke out in Iraq after the U.S. invasion, and because of the U.S. invasion, and that only grew in intensity. And at a certain point in 2006, the figures relative to the size of the country, I calculated, were the same or even greater than the figures of the casualties of the America's Civil War in the United States. It was enormous and totally unknown in the United States, unknown and not covered really by the American media, very, very skimpily. In fact, even what got me to write a book on Iraq was when Saddam Hussein was put on trial, and no other foreigners were put on trial with him. I thought there were a lot of American former heads of state, British politicians, arms dealers, etc., who should have been in the dock along with Saddam Hussein.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there because we're all out of time, but I really appreciate your effort along these lines and making sure that this history is not lost permanently.
I appreciate what you're doing. It's terrific.
Thanks very much. I appreciate that. All right, everybody, that is Barry Lando, former producer for 60 Minutes and author of The Watchman's File, as well as The Trial of Saddam Hussein. Read his latest in Counterpunch, The American Legacy in Iraq, and he's got links to the documentary film in the article as well. That's been Anti-War Radio for this morning. Thanks, everybody, very much for listening. We're here every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 9 on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA. My full interview archive is at scotthorton.org. See you next week.